one man who knows more than anybody else on this show, at least in the English language, at least, is Oli Vargas. He is the host of Latin America Review and co-founder of Causachon News. And he joins us now. Oli, thanks. Very good to see you again. I'm right, haven't I? It is a mixed bag, but let's start with the good news. Tell us about Lula and what we can expect now that he's back in the president's house.
Hi, George. It's really great to be back and speaking to you again. And absolutely, a very exciting news coming out of Brazil that, after being jailed on false charges, Lula is now being elected president of Brazil. And the former right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, is now in Miami, in understanding Orlando. Miami, like many disgraced former right-wing politicians in Latin America. So that's the situation in Brazil. And Lula's inauguration speech, I think, laid out his priorities going forward, a speech in which he shed a tear in a moment of touching vulnerability, you could say, when he was talking about the immense poverty that's been building up in Brazil, especially over the last few years, where inequality has been growing, where unemployment has been growing, where crime and violence, as a result of these things, has also been growing. And he also touched on issues such as protecting the environment, as many people know, the devastating forest fires that destroyed much of the Amazon during Bolsonaro's reign. He also stated very clearly about Brazil's commitment to Latin American integration. And Bolsonaro is someone that certainly, at least at the beginning of his term, looked more towards the United States than to Latin American neighbors. By the end of his term, he was flying solo after getting in his own personal fights with President Biden. But the cause of Latin American unity and Latin American sovereignty have been left by the wayside. And as a result, the whole of Latin America is weaker because Brazil is, of course, the largest country in Latin America, the biggest economy, one of the most important economies in the entire world. So to have a government that wasn't committed to building that Latin American unity was something that weakened the whole region. And now Brazil will be turning towards its natural allies within the region, countries like Bolivia, where I'm speaking to you from, and also, for example, Venezuela, where Bolsonaro, of course, had recognized the self-declared politician Juan Guaido as the so-called president of Venezuela, and expelled the legitimate ambassador of the government of Nicolas Maduro. That has now been annulled, and Brazil now has restored relations with the elected government of Venezuela at the head of President Nicolas Maduro, and they've restored full diplomatic and political relations. They've even lifted a law that Bolsonaro had introduced, the banning President Maduro from entering Brazil, something that was very damaging for both countries because they share a border, of course, and when you share a border with countries, there has to be a degree of cooperation. But the reckless policies of the previous government had broken down all those relationships within Latin America. So it's incredibly important for Latin America as a whole to have a president committed to building forums like, for example, UNASUR, that was destroyed by Bolsonaro, forums in which the countries of Latin America can come together, discuss this unity without the presence of the United States and Canada. And that's very important, that the United States and Canada are only ever in favor of regional forums in which they are included. But of course, they have very different interests to countries of Latin America. And the organizations built in the early 2000s by people like Lula, by people like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales, will now begin a process of being rebuilt. So that union among Latin America is something that Lula is going to spearhead. He even discussed during the campaign, the possibility of launching a currency for Latin America to trade in. This wouldn't be like the euro, which people use in their day-to-day. This would be a currency for trading because, of course, in Latin America, trade is done in US dollars rather than local currency. So Lula proposed a currency, so Latin America is no longer dependent on US dollar. These are some of the exciting policies that are being proposed.
Very interesting. We'll come to ex-President Juan Guaido in a minute. I think he might be applying for the Chelsea job, which must soon be available. But the Bolsonaro, we haven't heard the last of him, have we? He is now ensconced with the gold-toothed emigres in Miami. Best place for him. But he didn't give up willingly. He didn't give up graciously. He stayed until the last possible minute. He avoided Lula's inauguration. He nearly won the election. It was a close-run thing. And of course, if he hadn't fallen out with Biden, he might, in those circumstances, have been tempted to hang on in the hope of a military coup. Or will the right in Brazil find another champion? In other words, is Bolsonaro the new Juan Guaido, or is he a potential comeback kid?
Well, it'll have to be seen. I think if Bolsonaro hadn't got in the scrap that he had with Joe Biden, he may still be president now, having stayed through a sort of Fujimori-style self-coup. And it's quite an interesting dynamic, really, and it shows the lack of political nous on the part of Bolsonaro, which suggests that perhaps he won't be coming back as a figure in politics. And that is that, of course, when President Trump was in power, Bolsonaro was a very close ally of the United States. They were friends on a personal level. And then when Joe Biden was elected, he himself, especially Bolsonaro's sons, continued essentially running a campaign on behalf of Donald Trump. His children, who play a big role in the Brazilian government, were talking about the idea that the election was stolen from Trump. And so this put Brazil on a collision course with the United States. And now, of course, the United States, I think, Joe Biden, if Bolsonaro had been willing to play ball, Joe Biden would be more than happy to give Bolsonaro a helping hand. But I think Bolsonaro didn't have the political nous to, maintain some sort of alliance with the new administration in the United States. And so when the election time came, I think they were unwilling to support his fantasies of a coup. And I think that's definitely what he wanted to do. Before the election even took place, when all the polls showed that Lula was on course for victory, he started talking about how the election system is unreliable and open to being rigged for Lula. Of course, he is the one in power at that time. Of course, that was the same election system which he was elected on 4 years prior, but that was preparing the ground for a possible self-coup, as you'd say. But I think a lack of political strategy and not making friends with the White House, I think, left that idea dead in the water. Now he's in Orlando. I saw a picture yesterday, him in a KFC enjoying some chicken, and I think he may be dedicating himself to that over the next couple of years. Trump,
he might well have been meeting up with Donald Trump for a burger and Coke. Ollie, what can we do now about this Juan Guaido, who has now been de-recognized by Brazil? He has been kicked out by the Venezuelan opposition. He's no longer even the leader of the opposition, and yet all kinds of countries, including, incredibly, our own, the United Kingdom, recognizes somebody called Juan Guaido as the entirely fictitious president of the great oil-producing giant, Venezuela. And in fact, the Bank of England has given Venezuela's gold to this guy Juan Guaido. Where is that gold? And where is Juan Guaido in this now changed diplomatic picture?
You're right. The United Kingdom or the Bank of England is holding more than $1 billion worth of gold that belongs to the people of Venezuela, to the Venezuelan public, and in which in 2019, when the Venezuelan government wanted to withdraw that to weather some of the effects of the economic sanctions of the United States that were triggering, food shortages, medicine shortages. And so, of course, the Venezuelan government tried to recoup all the assets they had to try and provide a cushion for people during that time. And the British government decided, actually, no, we are now keeping hold of that gold. It's essentially no longer yours. Juan Guaido and his officials with assets like this, also in the United States, the oil company Citgo, which belongs to the Venezuelan government, was essentially taken over by the US government. And Juan Guaido was always trying to get hold of these sort of multi-billion dollar assets. Now that strategy of recognizing, a man that declared himself president in the street in 2019, has clearly failed. The majority, almost no Latin American countries recognize him as president anymore. I believe Paraguay and Uruguay still do, but the rest of the countries, surrounding Venezuela, no longer recognize it, and have now restored relations with the elected government of Venezuela, of President Nicolas Maduro. But for the United States, it's a difficult one because they clearly no longer want to, or they can see that this strategy has failed. It's a strategy that began under President Trump and then continued under President Biden almost entirely. But now it's become clear that it's no longer realistic. However, they don't want to be seen to be climbing down. But the other complicating factor, of course, for the United States is that they've now sanctioned Russia, which has disrupted energy markets on a tremendous level. And bringing back Venezuelan oil onto the global markets is something that could stabilize energy prices, that could stop some of the runaway fuel prices that we're seeing in places like Europe and the UK, etc. However, as I said, they don't want to be seen as climbing down. They don't want to make a move that would benefit the government of the Nicolas Maduro. But of course, they're now left with fewer and fewer options because their strategy to get rid of Maduro has failed. Also, they need Venezuelan oil. And there are negotiations going on right now, closed door negotiations between officials of the US government and the Venezuelan government about how Venezuelan oil can bring back. And of course, the context to all this, which is very important for me, the most important story coming out of Latin America over the past few years is the economic recovery of Venezuela. Venezuela's economy was destroyed by US sanctions, particularly around 2018, 2019 was the worst of it. GDP just absolutely collapsing, oil production absolutely collapsing. And now what we're seeing is Venezuela is the fastest growing economy in South America. It's getting double-digit GDP growth on a yearly basis. And in fact, 2021 was the first year since sanctions began where they had positive economic growth rather than negative economic growth. And monthly inflation is now down to single figures, around 7-8%. Which is lower than, for example, Argentina, which from a high of triple figures monthly inflation at the height of US sanctions. And so Venezuela has managed to restore oil production at over 1 million barrels a day now, which is 10 times what they had at the height of the sanctions. So Venezuela is in a much stronger position to negotiate. If this crisis, this conflict in Ukraine had happened in 2018 or 2019, Venezuela wouldn't have many cards to play. They were in a very desperate situation. However, they no longer are. So now they can demand respect for their sovereignty in exchange for their oil coming back onto the global markets.
Fascinating. Now, quickly, Ollie, although they deserve longer, Cristina is out the game, or is she, as a result of conviction? Many people, including me, believe a trumped-up conviction. And the poor president of Peru has been deposed. Tell us as succinctly as you can, and no one can do it more succinctly than you, about these two little vignettes.
Yes, Argentina has had an incredibly difficult year. Now it has the highest inflation in South America, higher than Venezuela. That's a hangover from the era of President Macri, who was brought in the IMF, indebted Argentina up to its eyeballs. And there's the levels of debt are simply too difficult to recover from at this point. And the runaway inflation has caused massive disappointment among people in the government led by President Alberto Fernandez, in which Cristina Fernandez is the vice president. And Cristina within that is a left-wing faction within the government. And she is calling for a much more aggressive approach against the IMF. And actually, I think that approach could mean that she could stand as president at the next elections and get quite a lot of support, including from people who are disappointed in this government, because she has a critique of what's going on. And yeah, definitely very interesting. Before I move on to Peru, I just wanted to say that I was lucky enough to be in Buenos Aires for the World Cup final and to join the people celebrating in the streets. Definitely a once in a lifetime experience. But yeah, on the question of Peru today, right now on Peru, there's a general strike going on across the country, mass protests going on in every town and city in the country, mostly from unions, rural, campesino, indigenous unions, against the unelected government that's taken power in Peru in very similar terms that happened in Bolivia in 2019. Like what happened here in 2019, there's been numerous massacres, around 30 dead. That number could climb tonight as protests are still raging on. And so we're going to keep an eye out for that. Of course, this has all received the support of the United States, and the deposed president Pedro Castillo is currently in prison. He's been sentenced to 18 months preventive detention. I mean, he hasn't been charged of anything, but he will be now in jail for at least 18 months, and then while investigations are held. And the demand of people in the streets is not only to bring back the president Pedro Castillo, but also to bring about a new constitution. That's because Peru's current constitution was made during the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori, who was the last dictator of Peru in the 90s, again supported by the United States, in which all of Peru's natural resources are privatized by law, by constitution, and the inequalities essentially entrenched in that constitution. So what people, especially in rural areas, want to see is a new constitution in which natural resources can be recovered for the public sector, and that wealth used to develop and bring people out of poverty. And now we're seeing this just huge divide between urban and rural, and including within the left itself, in middle class, urban left, perhaps more concerned with issues such as environmentalism or identity issues, whilst in rural areas we see unions organizing around this idea of taking back natural resources, of fighting against inequality. So that's the big divide right now in Peru, which is playing out in an incredibly violent manner.
Oli Vargas, you're a walking encyclopedia. Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse of what's happening in Latin America today.